Okay, I want to go back and correct one thing really quick I recorded last night on the Beat Generation. So you're going to have to make a note in your notes because I got some names mixed up. I guess I was a little tired. So Jack Kerouac is an author for On the Road, and Allen Ginsberg, Ginsburg, wrote Howl in 1959, and those are the two big beat beat generation writings. So I think I kind of got them a little bit mixed up, so I apologize for that. And this is going to kind of be the rise of the new left and the counterculture movement. Now, I've already addressed a lot of things on this slide as well, but I want to go back and touch a little bit more on urban immigrants. So there's a new Immigration Act passed in 1965, which is going to allow for the flood of immigrants from Latin American countries, especially Mexico and Asia, also Southeast Asia, Korea, and the Philippines for the next 3 decades. Part of the large insurgence of Koreans in Southeast Asia, of course, is the Korean War, followed by the Vietnam War and migrant labor from Mexico. It's estimated that we had undocumented aliens, that's what we call immigrants to our country, who are not here legally, at about 8 million. I'm sure that is at least doubled by today's standards. The Sun Belt area, California, Texas, Florida, is going to mostly be impacted by this, and that is going to include mainly Hispanic migrants. By 1990, so again, I'm sure this figure is fairly outdated, but Hispanics are going to account for about 25% of the population in Texas, Arizona, and California. 50% of the Hispanic population is going to be Mexican. All right, so there's going to be a shift from manufacturing economy to a service economy in 1970. And that's going to kind of have an impact on manufacturing jobs because those are going to go overseas due to cheaper labor. We're going to have stagflation, which we'll talk about here when we get into Nixon as well. All right, so in 1960, John F. Kennedy is going to be elected president. He is very young. He has a beautiful wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, and they come up with, they're young, they're beautiful, they have two beautiful young children. And so the White House, when he wins election, becomes known as Camelot for Arthur and Guinevere, and they just kind of have this aura about them. Television cameras are allowed in the White House with Mrs. Kennedy giving tours, and they're just very a beautiful American couple. They are our American royalty. So the election of 1960 is going to take place between Senator John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts and Vice President Richard Nixon. Nixon was a fantastic vice president. I know we kind of look at him as not a great president because of Watergate, but he did a lot as the vice president. Lyndon B. Johnson, who at the time is the Senate Majority Leader, is going to become Kennedy's vice presidential nomination. And Kennedy's president is going to be called the New Frontier. All right. And that's because his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention said, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, a frontier of unknown opportunities and paths, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats. The new frontier I speak is not a set of promises, it is a set of challenges." Okay. And Kennedy is Catholic, so his campaign is going to have some major issues. Um, so that's going to happen until Kennedy gives a speech in front of Protestant ministers that he has accepted the separation of church and state, and that Catholic leaders would not tell him how to act as president. The debates. So you know a lot about debates this year because of the election. This is the first time a presidential debate has ever been televised. And a lot of people say this is why Kennedy wins the election. Kennedy looked young and vibrant on television. Nixon looked pale, pasty, and sick because of the type of makeup that they used on him prior to the election. it didn't look good for Nixon. But if you listen to it on the radio and not on television, you said typically that Nixon won the debate. If you watched it on television, Kennedy was clearly the winner. Kennedy is going to earn the support of African Americans during the election when he arranged for Martin Luther King to be released from jail. And Kennedy is going to win in the Electoral College 303 to 219. The closest election in U.S. history at the time. He was the youngest president elected at 43 and the only Catholic president in U.S. history. The Democrats also get both houses of Congress. At his inauguration speech, the famous line, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." All right, so domestic policies for Kennedy are going to include the following. We've got minimum wage being raised to $1.25 an hour, extended to 3 million workers. We've got a Housing Act of 1961 to provide nearly $5 billion over 4 years for preservation of open urban spaces, development of mass transit, and construction of middle class houses. We also go into the space race. Kennedy promotes a $24 billion project to land the Americans on the move. As early as the 1960s, the U.S. are behind the Russians in space technology, but we are going to catch up. And on 1969, the Apollo 11 mission is going to transport 2 American astronauts to the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. All right, we move on to JFK and civil rights. All right, JFK didn't do anything during his first 2 years because he didn't want to lose the white or black Southern vote. And many civil rights initiatives that were in Congress at the time were mostly symbolic measures. And his brother, who's Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, attempted to enfranchise the South, and that was pretty unsuccessful at the time. Only a small percentage of blacks were able to register to vote due to spelling mistakes on the literacy test, poll taxes, in white primaries, or the grandfather clauses. So all of those Jim Crow restrictions on voting were still taking place, especially in the South. All right, in 1961, the Freedom Riders are going to ride interstate buses to verify that segregation was not occurring. In Alabama, Freedom Riders are arrested by police, state troopers, and the National Guard. Freedom Riders continue through all summer. His brother is going to petition the Interstate Commerce Commission to make sure that segregation of interstate facilities are not occurring, which again, interstate facilities are like the rest areas. So this is the Freedom Riders bus right here. So you can see it's been bombed out at smoke. If you watch the movie The Butler, there's a picture of this as well. All right, so there's going to be a showdown in Birmingham, Alabama. Okay, in 1963, Birmingham, Alabama is going to close all parks, playgrounds, swimming pools, golf courses in the city to avoid having to desegregate them. And Martin Luther King is going to pick Birmingham as a place to stage a protest because of this reason. He is going to go to jail for about 2 weeks because he leads a march in Birmingham that does not have a permit. Public pressure is starting to mount for civil rights legislation. Local business leaders allow big department stores to start to desegregate, and King will call off all demonstrations in Birmingham. But King's motel is bombed, as was his brother's home, and that ends up causing riots in Birmingham. John F. Kennedy is going to side with King and starts in 1963 to actively pursue a policy in civil rights. JFK, like Eisenhower, is going to federalize the Alabama National Guard to enforce a court order requiring admissions of 2 black students at the University of Alabama. You can see this scene in Forrest Gump. Governor George Wallace is going to stand in the doorway to protect states' rights that were being crushed by the federal government. And his famous speech is segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. That night, Medgar Evers, who is the NAACP director in Mississippi, was assassinated. And this is seen as retaliation for the University of Alabama incident. In response, JFK would send Congress a civil rights bill that would crush segregation, outlaw discrimination in elections, and give the Justice Department authority to enforce school integration. All right, and here we have Martin Luther King's famous March on Washington, which is going to occur in August 28, 1963. At the time, it was the largest protest in U.S. history, about 200,000 people. And this is where Martin Luther King is going to give his famous I Have a Dream speech, which I have included the clip for you here on YouTube. So that is pretty much what wraps up most of Kennedy's domestic policy, other than the Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps, which I'll come back to here in a minute. But Kennedy is also going to be known for his domestic policy or foreign policy and having to deal with this Cold War. So we've had containment, we have had mutual assured destruction, and we have had brinkmanship. Kennedy is going to be known for his flexible response. Kennedy is going to develop conventional military targets to deal with difficult challenges around the world. When JFK becomes president, the missile gap is going to be in favor of the United States, and he is going to continue a peacetime military buildup. Because he feels we're going to be fighting localized wars in the third world. Kennedy is going to back away from nuclear weapons. He is going to create the Green Berets, which is an elite command force. And he is going to focus on a nuclear arsenal that can handle a second strike capability, meaning if the United States is bombed first, these weapons would be able to be our retaliatory force. In the 1960s, we have the Bay of Pigs incident. Eisenhower had already authorized the CIA to organize and train a Central American brigade of about 1,400 Cuban exiles for the invasion of Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. This would in hope ensure an uprising in Cuba, and we would be able to install a leader who was more friendly towards the United States and not Russia. JFK is going to continue this plan, and in April of 61, the Bay of Pigs invasion is going to occur. The forces are forced to surrender. It is an absolute disaster. And Kennedy really didn't want to do this. Right before the invasion occurred, he thought this was a pretty bad idea, but it was too far to go. 400 of the 1,400 were killed. Only 14 were actually rescued, and the Cuban people generally did not support the invasion. Therefore, there was no popular uprising. Kennedy takes full responsibility on national television for the bad idea. Privately, Kennedy is going to blame the CIA for bad information. Why it's significant, the USSR and Cuba are going to become closer and start planning for a true defense of a future U.S. invasion. Then we go to Operation Mongoose, another failed attempt after the Cuban Missile Crisis to assassinate Fidel Castro. Kennedy is going to implement the Peace Corps to send young volunteers, doctors, lawyers, engineers to third world countries to contribute and help with local projects, improve economic conditions, poor health, and inadequate education. Alliance for Progress in 1961 is Kennedy's plan to give $12 billion to Latin America, basically the Latin American version of the Marshall Plan. Primary goal is to help Latin American countries close the gap between the rich and the poor, thus not going towards communism.